On a Thursday morning in late September of 2021, Nadine Fortin stood at the edge of her apple orchard in Compton County, Quebec, and watched the refrigerated storage unit she had borrowed money to build begin to fail in the most expensive way possible. She was 52 years old. She had spent the last 11 years rebuilding her family's operation from what her ex-husband had left behind, which was not much, into something that had, by the fall of 2021, become one of the more respected mid-scale apple operations in the eastern townships. 4 varieties, 62 acres under production. A contract with a regional grocery distributor out of Sherbrooke that bought controlled atmosphere stored apples through to March, and a smaller arrangement with 2 local cideries that had kept her cash flow stable through 2 difficult winters. She had done all of it on her own credit, against the quiet skepticism of neighbors who had watched her take over the operation alone and had given her, privately, 2 or 3 years before she walked away. The problem was the storage. Let me tell you what Nadine had built, because you need to understand what was at stake before you can understand what she was about to lose. In the spring of 2020, Nadine had invested in a controlled atmosphere storage system, a sealed refrigerated environment where oxygen levels are reduced and carbon dioxide is precisely managed to slow the respiration of stored apples and extend their marketable life from weeks to months. It was not a new technology. Orchards across Ontario and British Columbia had been using it for decades. But for a mid-scale operation in Compton County, it represented the kind of capital commitment that either transformed a business or finished it. The unit held 18,000 bushels across 3 sealed chambers. The equipment had cost her $280,000 installed, financed against the next 2 seasons of distributor contracts. The logic was sound. The timing, as it turned out, was not. What the projections hadn't fully accounted for was a harvest season that arrived 2 weeks early, following an August of unusual heat, combined with a controller failure in the primary CA unit that her technician had flagged in August and that the equipment supplier had promised to address before harvest and had not. By the 3rd week of September, Chamber 2 was running oxygen levels 3 points above target. The apples in that chamber were respiring faster than they should have been. Ethylene was building, and ethylene in a controlled atmosphere system is not a minor problem. It is the signal that triggers ripening across the entire stored mass, and once it builds past a certain threshold in a sealed chamber, it moves faster than any mechanical intervention can counter. Her options as her equipment supplier had explained on a Wednesday afternoon call that she had taken sitting in her truck at the edge of the orchard because she had not wanted her 2 employees to see her face during it, were not good ones. She could vent the chamber, which would compromise the controlled atmosphere entirely and reduce her storage window from 5 months to perhaps 6 weeks, which would mean selling into the October market glut at prices that would not cover her input costs. She could attempt an emergency repair on the controller, which the supplier estimated would take 10 to 14 days, and which her agronomist had told her the apples did not have. Or she could begin an emergency transfer of the chamber 2 inventory to cold storage elsewhere, which would require refrigerated transport she did not have booked and could not get on short notice in the 3rd week of September, when every cold storage facility in the townships was handling its own harvest. She was standing at the storage unit door on that Thursday morning, phone in one hand and a list of calls she had already made and that had already gone nowhere in the other, when the truck turned off the road and came up her lane. Let me tell you about Fernand Beaupré, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he saw when he looked at Nadine's situation. Fernand was 74 years old, and he had been growing apples in Compton County since 1974. His operation sat 8 kilometers east of Nadine's on land his parents had planted in the 1950s, and the two of them knew each other the way people in small Quebec counties always know each other, well enough to wave at the co-op, well enough to have shared a table at the annual growers' meeting 3 or 4 times, not well enough to have ever sat down and talked seriously about the work. Fernand had grown up in an orchard and he had spent 50 years inside one, which meant he had accumulated a kind of knowledge that does not appear in any certification program and cannot be purchased from any equipment supplier. He had made it through the 1988 freeze that had taken out 1/3 of the orchards in the townships without losing a single productive tree. He had made it through 3 separate seasons of fire blight, the bacterial infection that travels invisibly through an orchard and can destroy a decade of work in a single summer without losing a significant percentage of his yield. He had a reputation in the county, not for being modern, not for having the newest equipment or the cleanest operation, but for being someone who had seen enough that he almost never made the same mistake twice and almost always knew which mistake he was looking at when he saw one in someone else's orchard. What most people in the county also knew, though fewer thought much about it, was that Fernand had been managing apple storage since 1971, not at the commercial scale Nadine operated. His cold storage was his own. 2 insulated rooms he had built into the hillside behind his packing shed in 1979 and modified twice since, using methods that had more in common with the root cellar traditions his grandfather had used than with the controlled atmosphere technology that had become the industry standard. He monitored temperature with analog gauges he had been reading for 40 years. He monitored ethylene with a detection method he had adapted from a viticulture publication he had found at a library in Magog in 1986, which involved a specific combination of ventilation timing and absorbent material placement that no equipment manufacturer had ever sold and that most contemporary agronomists would have described, if they had heard of it, as unnecessarily complicated. He had a logbook, not a tablet, not a software system. A logbook with a green cover that his wife Therese had given him in 1978, filled now with 6 more volumes in the same format, sitting on a shelf in the packing shed. Every storage cycle since 1977, every temperature anomaly, every ethylene event, every intervention. 44 years of apple storage data in his handwriting. He had been driving past Nadine's operation every few days for the past 2 weeks on his way to the hardware cooperative in Coaticook. He had been watching the refrigerated unit. He had been watching the ventilation pattern. And he had pulled into her lane because what he had seen from the road on Tuesday had told him something that he wanted to confirm. Nadine walked over to his truck with the expression of someone who had not slept well and was not in a position to be polite about it. Fernand looked at her for a moment. Then he said, in the quiet way of a man who does not feel the need to qualify what he knows, "You have an ethylene problem in the second chamber, but I don't think it's as far along as they're telling you." Nadine looked at him. "How do you know which chamber?" "The east vent on that unit has been cycling at the wrong interval for 8 days. I've been watching it from the road." Nadine said nothing. She had not known anyone else could read that. "How long since your controller failed?" Fernand asked. "Confirmed failure September 10th. Probably started before that." Fernand nodded the way old farmers nod at information they already have. "And your distributor contract, what's the delivery window?" "First delivery February 15th, final March 8th." He nodded again. "Show me the chamber readings for the past 3 weeks." "Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had the experience of someone looking at a problem you have been living inside for 2 weeks and asking the right questions in the first 4 minutes? It is a specific sensation. It is not comfortable. It is the feeling of realizing that the framework you have been using to understand your situation was built for a different situation, and that the person standing in front of you, the person who pulled off the road in a truck that was older than your storage unit, has a different framework entirely, one that was built for exactly this. Nadine Fortin was not someone who asked for help easily. She had rebuilt her operation alone. She had negotiated her own contracts, arranged her own financing, managed her own equipment failures, and handled 2 harvest seasons as a single operator without calling on anyone. She had a particular kind of self-sufficiency that women who build things in rural Quebec often develop, not coldness exactly, but a settled understanding that the help that gets offered is usually not the help that is needed, and that learning to need specific things from specific people is a skill that takes years to trust. She showed Fernand the chamber readings. He looked at them for about 5 minutes, standing in the packing shed with the logbook open on the table beside him. His logbook, which he had brought in from his truck without being asked. He asked 3 questions about her ventilation sequencing. He asked 1 question about the variety breakdown in Chamber 2, which was 2/3 Honeycrisp and 1/3 Cortland, and which mattered, he explained, because Honeycrisp has a higher ethylene sensitivity than almost any commercial variety and behaves differently from Cortland under stress conditions in ways that affect the management approach. Then he went quiet for a moment and looked at the readings again. Your Cortland is fine, he said. Your Honeycrisp is stressed, but it is not past the threshold. Your controller failure gave you an oxygen spike, which is what triggered the ethylene response, but you have not had sustained elevated ethylene long enough to reach the autocatalytic stage. He paused. Do you know what that means? Nadine said she had read about it but was not certain she understood it in practice. It means the fruit is alarmed, Fernand said, but it has not yet made a decision. There is a window. It is not a long one. Nadine said the equipment supplier told me the controller repair would take 2 weeks. Fernand said, I'm not talking about the controller. He walked her outside and looked at the unit for a while without speaking. Then he asked about her ventilation motor and her manual override capacity and the specific dimensions of the east vent housing, which Nadine pulled from her installation documents. He looked at the documents. He asked if she had anywhere on the property that she could source food-grade potassium permanganate. Nadine said she did not know what that was. Fernand said it's an ethylene absorber. Orchards in BC have been using it in modified atmospheres since the 80s. The cideries in the region use it for fermentation control. You said you have 2 cidery contracts. Nadine said Demine Gosselin and Cidrerie Lacombe. Fernand said call Lacombe, he'll have it. Let me tell you what Fernand Beaupré proposed, because it was not anything Nadine had been offered by her equipment supplier, her agronomist, or the 2 cold storage consultants she had contacted in the previous week. What Fernand had developed over 44 years of hillside cold storage was not a commercial system and not a published method. It was a ventilation and absorption protocol he had built through iteration, through failed experiments in 1983 and 1991 and 1998, through an extension service publication from Ontario that he had received through an agricultural library network in 1985, and that had described the underlying chemistry without describing any specific application, and through the accumulated experience of watching how apples behaved under specific conditions in his specific storage environment. He had solved his own ethylene events 4 times since 1977. The method he had developed could not be purchased from any supplier. It could not be found in any current certification curriculum. It existed because he had needed it and had built it, and because he had written down what had worked and what hadn't every time in the logbooks on the shelf in his packing shed. What he proposed was a manual ethylene management protocol for Chamber 2, a specific ventilation sequence run at 3-hour intervals through the vent housing, combined with a potassium permanganate application placed at 4 specific positions inside the chamber based on the airflow pattern Fernand had mapped by looking at Nadine's installation drawings. It would not replace the controller, it would not restore her controlled atmosphere to spec. But it would, he believed, hold the ethylene below the autocatalytic threshold for long enough to give the Honeycrisp a realistic path to February. It required someone to be at the unit every 3 hours through the night for the first 4 days. Nadine's farm manager, a 35-year-old named Joelle, who had worked for her for 4 years and who had been present for the last part of Fernand's explanation, said carefully, "That's not a protocol I've seen documented anywhere." Fernand looked at him. "No, it wouldn't be." Joelle said, "No offense, but if there was a ventilation-based ethylene management approach that worked at this scale, the industry would know about it." Fernand was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The industry knows about ethylene scrubbers that cost $40,000 and equipment controllers that take 2 weeks to repair. This is neither of those things. You can wait for those, or you can try this." There was a silence. Nadine said, "Tell me what we need." "Let me tell you about the next 4 days, because they are the reason this story gets told the way it gets told in Compton County, and in the growers' meetings in Coaticook and at the co-op in Waterville, when the people who were there start talking about what they saw that September." Fernand's approach required materials that were not sophisticated. Potassium permanganate sachets drove to Cidrerie-Lacombe that afternoon and came back with enough. A modified vent cover that Fernand fabricated in Nadine's workshop in 2 hours from materials she had on hand, and a timing protocol that Fernand wrote out by hand on the back of a seed catalog that was sitting on the workshop table. He did not write it on his phone. He did not produce a document. He wrote it in the same way he had been recording things since 1978, which was clearly and without decoration, because clarity was the only thing that mattered at 4 in the morning when you were tired and the temperature had dropped and you needed to know exactly what to do. Joelle looked at the fabricated vent cover when Fernand brought it out and said nothing. One of Nadine's 2 seasonal workers said nothing either, though the way they said nothing communicated something. Fernand and Nadine ran the first ventilation cycle at 6 in the evening. It was not dramatic. A vent opened at a specific angle for a specific duration. A sachet was repositioned according to the map Fernand had drawn. A reading was taken and recorded. Fernand checked the recording against his logbook entry from 1998, which had been the closest analog situation he had documented. He made one adjustment to the timing interval. He explained the adjustment to Nadine and wrote the reason in the margin of the seed catalog. At 2 in the morning, Nadine ran the cycle alone for the first time. Fernand had gone home at 10:30 and was back at 6 with coffee and without any particular ceremony. He checked her recordings. He said, "Good," which from Fernand, Nadine later told a neighbor, was the equivalent of anyone else saying you had done something exactly right. On the second day, the ethylene readings from the monitoring equipment Fernand had asked Joelle to rent from an agricultural supplier in Sherbrooke showed a plateau. Not a reduction, not yet, but the rate of increase had slowed. Fernand looked at the numbers and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "The Cortland is already stable. The Honeycrisp is deciding." Nadine asked what it was deciding. Fernand said, "Whether to ripen or to wait. We're giving it a reason to wait." On the third morning, the reading dropped. Not significantly, 0.3 parts per million. Joelle looked at the number and looked at Fernand and said, "Is that meaningful?" Fern said, "In a sealed chamber with a compromised controller and 3 weeks of elevated oxygen, A drop of any kind on day 3 means the intervention is working. Let me tell you about the next 2 days, because this is where what Fernand had drawn on the back of a seed catalog became something that Nadine and Joël could not argue with. By day 4, the ethylene levels in chamber 2 had returned to a range that Nadine's agronomist, who had come out on day 3 skeptically at Nadine's request, described as unexpectedly acceptable. She had used the word unexpectedly twice, and both times Fernand had not reacted. He had the affect of a man completing a task he had completed before, which was exactly what he was doing. The controlled atmosphere was not restored to full specification. It could not be without the controller repair, which was completed in the 3rd week of October. But the window that Fernand had said existed, the window between an ethylene alarm and an ethylene decision, had been held open long enough for the intervention to work, and when the controller came back online, the inventory in Chamber 2 was in better condition than any of the projections from the previous week had suggested it could be. The final accounting, which Nadine did on a Saturday morning in late October, sitting at her kitchen table with her farm records and a coffee she actually drank, was not painless. She had lost approximately 200 bushels in the early ethylene damage before Fernand had arrived. Fruit that would sell at a discount to the cideries, which would take it, which was a loss but a manageable one. The remaining 15,800 bushels in Chamber 2 were projected to hold to her February delivery window within acceptable parameters. Her distributor contract would be fulfilled. Her cidery contracts would be fulfilled with the distressed fruit at adjusted pricing she had already negotiated. The total financial damage, which had looked like a potential end to her operation 8 days earlier, was now something she could absorb over the following year without losing the land or the contracts or the 7 years of relationship building she had done with the people who bought her fruit. She had not been saved completely. She had been saved enough, which was all that the situation had ever required, and which no one with commercial credentials or equipment supplier relationships had been able to offer her. She drove to Fernand's farm on a Sunday morning. He was in the equipment shed behind the packing house doing something to a tractor part she didn't recognize, and he looked up and set down the wrench and didn't seem surprised that she had come. Nadine said, "I want to pay you properly. Name a number." Fernand said, "I don't want money for this." Nadine said, "Then tell me what you want." Fernand thought about it for a moment. The Compton County Growers Association is trying to keep the winter storage workshop funded. They run it in January at the Agricultural Center in Cookshire. 10 years ago, 60 people came. Last year there were 14. If you could bring the number up, it would help. Nadine made some calls that week. She used the credibility she had built over 7 years of being someone who operated a serious orchard seriously, and she used the specific credibility she had earned in the previous 8 days of being someone who had been in trouble and had been pulled out of it by the knowledge that was being taught at that workshop. 31 people came to the January session. Fernand led it. He brought the green logbook and 6 of the subsequent volumes, and he talked for 2 hours about the things that 44 years of storage management had taught him, and that no certification program currently offered. But that is not the part of that Sunday that Nadine carried with her. She stayed for 3 hours in Fernand's equipment shed, and she asked questions, and he answered them with the patience of someone who had been waiting for someone to ask. He talked about ethylene sensitivity as a spectrum rather than a threshold, about the difference between a fruit that has been alarmed and a fruit that has made its decision, about the ways that the commercial CA industry had optimized for scale and had lost, in that optimization, some willingness to work slowly and read what was actually in front of you rather than what the control panel summary was reporting. He talked about the potassium permanganate protocol and the 17 years it had taken to develop it through trial and documentation, and the Ontario Extension publication that had given him the underlying chemistry and that he had never been able to find a second copy of, and the 1991 season when the method had failed and what the failure had taught him about chamber geometry. Nadine asked, "Why didn't you publish this? Submit it to the Growers Association, get it into the certification program?" Fernand said, "I wrote it up once, in 1997, sent it to the Provincial Extension Service. They sent back a letter saying the approach was not generalizable to commercial-scale operations, and they appreciated the submission." Nadine said nothing for a moment. Fernand said, "Knowledge that doesn't fit the current system doesn't disappear, it just waits." Nadine said, "I should have come to you 3 weeks ago." Fernand said, "You wouldn't have had a reason to listen 3 weeks ago. You needed to run out of options first." This was true. Nadine knew it was true. She didn't say anything in response to it because there was nothing to say. Let me tell you what happened over the next 4 years, because the story doesn't end in Compton County in the fall of 2021. Nadine Fortin changed things about how she ran her operation. Not dramatically, she hired a part-time storage consultant, a woman named Annette Villeneuve, who was 62 years old and had spent 25 years managing cold storage for a cooperative in the Okanagan before moving back to Quebec, who charged less than the equipment supplier's technical service, and who Nadine found through Fernand. She began keeping a paper logbook alongside her digital monitoring system, not because paper was better, but because writing the readings by hand forced her to actually think about what she was reading rather than scanning a screen and assuming the system would flag anything important. She started making the drive to Fernand's farm every month or so, not for any specific purpose, but because she had learned something about the cost of not knowing what was available within 8 kilometers of her property. Fernand Beaupré died in January of 2025 at the age of 77, in the house his parents had built in 1951. His funeral in Cookshire was attended by more people than the church had expected, many of them farmers, many of them younger than Fernand, many of them people who had not known him well but who had heard a specific story about a specific September and had come because the story had mattered to them in a way that was difficult to explain. His son, Patrick, inherited the farm and the packing shed and the 6 logbooks and the green-covered original, and the equipment shed full of fabricated tools that most people would not have been able to identify, and that Patrick understood completely because he had been watching his father use them since he was old enough to stand beside a storage door and hold a reading sheet. Patrick ran the operation the same way his father had run it, not because it was the only way, but because it worked, and because he had seen it work his entire life, and because he understood that there was a difference between a method being old and a method being finished. Let me tell you one last thing, because it is the reason this story is still told. In the fall of 2025, a younger orchard operator in Brome County, a 33-year-old named Theodore Racine, who had started his storage business in 2022, on capital he had raised partly from a provincial agricultural development grant and partly from a family loan, and who had expanded into controlled atmosphere on exactly the same logic Nadine had used 4 years earlier, found himself in a situation that involved a controller malfunction, a building ethylene event, an equipment supplier on hold, and an agronomist whose advice amounted to a choice between 2 options that would both result in significant losses. He had heard about Nadine Fortin and Fernand Beaupré. Most people in the growers' community had heard it by then, but hearing a story and trusting what it's telling you are different things, and Theodore had grown up in an era of precision agricultural technology and remote sensor monitoring and AI-assisted storage management, dollars. And the idea that the answer to a commercial CA failure was a handwritten protocol developed by a man who had died the previous January was not where his mind went first. Dollars. Nadine drove to Theodore's facility on a Wednesday uninvited, the same way Fernand had come up her lane 4 years earlier. She looked at the ventilation pattern. She asked about the ethylene readings for the past 10 days. She stood in the packing shed and looked at the controller unit and asked 2 questions about the vent sequencing that Theodore answered honestly and that she received without comment. Then she said, I know who you need to call. Theodore said, who? Nadine said, Patrick Beaupre, Compton County. He has a protocol that doesn't look like anything current and works on problems the current systems aren't designed for. It was developed over 40 years in storage conditions 12 kilometers from here. You'll read the documentation and think it can't be serious. Call him anyway. Is it fast? Nadine looked at him. It's going to work on the actual problem in front of you instead of the problem the equipment was sold to solve. That's not the same question as fast. There was a pause. Theodore Racine called Patrick Beaupre that afternoon. Patrick arrived the following morning with the modified vent cover and the potassium permanganate and the 7th logbook, which he had started the year his father died, in the same format, with the same attention, because that was how the knowledge stayed alive, not in a database, not in a certification module, not in a supplier's technical manual, but in the handwriting of someone who had been paying close enough attention to write it down correctly. He sat at Theodore's packing shed table and drew the same diagram his father had drawn. On the back of an envelope, because there was no seed catalog within reach, showing exactly what the intervention would do and why the chamber geometry cooperated with the airflow physics if you gave it the right conditions and enough patience. The words were different from his father's words because Patrick was a different man. But the understanding behind them was the same, because the chemistry of apples under stress has not changed, and the knowledge of how to read it, slowly, in writing, from a specific green-covered logbook in 1978 to a specific 7th volume in 2025, had been passed from father to son along with the farm and the equipment shed and the 44 years of documentation that no provincial extension service had ever found a way to file. Theodore Racine's fruit was saved. Not all of it, nothing is ever all of it, but enough to hold the contract, enough to keep the operation whole for another year, enough to matter. Some knowledge is not built to be sold. It is built because a specific problem existed, and the person who faced it decided to solve it carefully and write down what they learned and not throw the notes away. And it moves the way useful things move in small communities, not through press releases or product launches, but through someone pulling up a lane uninvited, asking the right questions in the first 4 minutes, and staying long enough for the person who needed help to understand that the help being offered was real. The logbooks are still on the shelf in the Beaupre packing shed in Compton County. Patrick has added to the 7th volume twice this year already. The Provincial Extension Service would call the method undocumented. The equipment suppliers would call it obsolete. The Controlled Atmosphere Certification Program does not include it in any current module. Patrick Beaupre runs the protocol anyway, because there is a difference between knowledge that the system has stopped teaching and knowledge that has stopped being true. And every orchard operator who has stood at a storage door in September with a failing controller and no good options understands that difference in a way that is very hard to put into a curriculum and very easy to lose if the people who carry it stop writing it down. I keep thinking about the moment Joel said there was no documentation for what Fernand was proposing. He wasn't wrong to say it. He was doing exactly what any careful person would do, asking for the proof before trusting the claim. And yet the proof was standing right in front of him, in a man who had been solving the same class of problems since before Joel was born, and who had written every intervention down in a green-covered logbook that nobody had ever thought to ask to read. That's the thing about Nadine's situation that stays with me. It wasn't that the knowledge didn't exist. It was that nobody had thought to go looking for it in the right direction. The equipment supplier had a support line. The agronomist had a certification. The cold storage consultants had credentials, and none of them had what Fernand had, which was 44 years of paying close attention and being honest enough to write down the times it hadn't worked. There's something in that I think about when I'm tempted to measure someone's usefulness by how recently they acquired what they know. Fernand wasn't valuable despite his age. He was valuable because of what his age represented, which was time spent accumulating understanding that can only come from repetition, from failure, from the specific kind of patience that makes you sit on a tailgate and draw a diagram instead of sending a quote for replacement equipment. That's not just knowledge, that's character. That's the willingness to do the slow thing when the slow thing is what the situation actually requires. And Nadine, I think about what it cost her to let him in. She had built everything herself: the orchard, the contracts, the financing, the reputation. Asking for help, real help, the kind where you step back and follow someone else's lead, was not something she had needed to do for years. But she did it. She said, "Tell me what we need," and she meant it. That kind of honesty about your own limits, when your limits are the thing standing between you and losing something you spent 7 years building, that takes a particular kind of courage that doesn't get talked about enough. The 3 nights of running the ventilation cycle at 2 in the morning, the discipline of writing the readings down even when you were exhausted and wanted to believe the numbers were fine, the willingness to keep going through 4 days of uncertainty when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. That's not a management strategy. That's what it looks like. When someone decides that the thing they've built is worth protecting through discomfort. What I come back to is this: Fernand didn't show up because he was paid to. He showed up because he had been watching from the road, and he recognized a problem he knew how to address, and he understood that the cost of saying nothing was higher than the cost of pulling up a lane uninvited. That's a kind of moral clarity that doesn't require a framework or a philosophy. It just requires being the kind of person who acts on what they notice. Patrick is still running the protocol. The logbook is on the shelf in Compton County, and somewhere in Brome County, Theodore Racine's apples made it to February. Some things carry forward because someone decided they were worth carrying.